You guys don't need to worry about me getting revenge from Diddy. I've got 3 moves that make sure he'll never be able to come after me or my family. First, I personally reached out to the victims' legal teams. The real reason he's not getting out is those buried cases behind the scenes. I provided legal funding for 7 victims who had been silent for years and brought in the top criminal attorneys in the country. Second, I bought up every potential post-release business deal he had lined up. I planned this 2 years in advance, so by the time he got sentenced and still had hope of getting out, every partner had already cut ties with him. Third, I don't just have evidence, I've got backups. This is an entire minefield that's been buried for 20 years. I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, Beyonce, Oprah Winfrey, Kim Kardashian, all of them were Diddy's handlers.
What happens when a platform doesn't cancel a story, but quietly removes parts of it? Because that's the detail most people missed. When 50 Cent's documentary about Diddy dropped, the conversation wasn't just about what was shown, it was about what never made it on screen. Not because it didn't exist, but because certain pieces were considered too risky to include. That distinction matters. Netflix didn't say the story was false. They didn't pull the project. They didn't shut it down. They approved it, released it, promoted it, and still said no to specific material. That tells you something important right away. In this industry, refusal is rarely about truth. It's about exposure. And exposure isn't dangerous because of one clip. It's dangerous because of context. 50 Cent made it clear the 4 episodes barely scratched the surface, that there were conversations, footage, and connections that never reached the final cut. Not because they didn't fit the runtime, but because once certain things sit side by side, the story changes. This isn't about secret files or dramatic reveals. It's about patterns that only become visible when nothing is edited out. And that's exactly where platforms get uncomfortable. Because once something is shown, it can't be unseen. Once it's archived, it can't be controlled. Think about it. If everything was harmless, why remove anything at all? This is where the real tension begins. Not in what was released, but in what was withheld. Because withholding isn't neutral, it's a decision. A decision that says, this part changes how people understand the whole. Before we go deeper, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any updates. Stories like this don't end in one upload. What makes this moment different is that 50 Cent didn't accept the silence. He didn't let the edits be the final word. Instead, he shifted the conversation away from platforms and back to the audience. Because once something exists outside traditional systems, control starts slipping. This isn't about proving anything. It's about asking why certain material never gets daylight, why some footage is always too sensitive, why some stories are allowed to exist only in fragments. Silence works best when people assume it means nothing was there. But what if silence means something was there, and it just wasn't convenient? That's the question this story opens with. And once you start thinking about that, the documentary feels very different. Because suddenly, the most important part of the story is what you weren't allowed to see. Once you understand that, the focus shifts, not to the clips themselves, but to the decision-making behind them. Because in media, nothing gets removed by accident. Every cut is deliberate. Every omission passes through layers of approval, legal teams, executives, risk assessments. And when something is still judged too much, even after edits, it's never because it's irrelevant. It's because it reframes the story. 50 Cent hinted at this without spelling it out. He didn't say Netflix lied. He didn't accuse them of protecting anyone. He simply said the format couldn't hold everything, that some material didn't belong inside a tightly controlled release window. That wording matters. Platforms don't fear information, they fear association. They fear how dots connect once the audience is allowed to connect them freely. Because a single clip can be dismissed, a rumor can be ignored, but sequences, timelines, repeated behavior, those are harder to explain away. This is why unreleased doesn't mean fake. It means unresolved. And unresolved material is dangerous because it invites questions instead of conclusions. It pushes viewers to reevaluate moments they already accepted and to notice who appears repeatedly, who stays silent consistently, and who benefits when attention moves on. What's uncomfortable isn't the idea of unseen footage. It's the idea that the audience wasn't trusted with context. Think about how often that happens. Stories get simplified, edges get smoothed, complications get removed for clarity. But clarity isn't always truth. Sometimes it's containment. Once you see that, you realize the real power isn't in showing everything. It's in deciding what never gets framed. That's why independent releases change the game. Because they don't rely on brand safety. They don't answer to advertisers. They don't worry about long-term relationships behind closed doors. They speak directly to viewers and let viewers decide what matters. And that terrifies systems built on control. Because once material exists outside the edit room, it can't be shaped the same way. It doesn't need permission to circulate. It doesn't need approval to be discussed. And it doesn't disappear just because someone says it shouldn't exist. This is the moment where silence stops working. Because silence only protects something when people don't know what's missing. But when the audience realizes parts were intentionally left out, every gap starts to feel intentional too. Not proof. Pressure. Pressure that asks one simple question again and again. If nothing there changed the story, why was it removed? And once that question settles in, the story stops being about Diddy or Netflix or even 50 Cent. It becomes about who gets to decide what the public is allowed to see and who's been making that decision for years. Now, by the time you reach this point, something important changes. You stop waiting for the reveal because the real tension isn't in what might exist. It's in how carefully everything has been handled so far. Think about it. If unreleased material truly didn't matter, it wouldn't need explanation. It wouldn't need to be acknowledged at all. It would just disappear quietly, like countless hours of unused footage that never get mentioned. But this didn't disappear quietly. It was referenced, hinted at, framed as too much, not fitting, outside the scope. And those phrases aren't neutral. They're signals. They tell you the issue isn't quality, it's consequence. Because footage doesn't threaten systems. Context does. Context is what turns isolated moments into patterns. It's what forces timelines to line up. It's what makes viewers ask why the same names appear again and again, and why certain reactions always arrive at the same moments. That's why platforms prefer fragments. Fragments can be dismissed. Fragments can be debated. Fragments can be forgotten. But sequences linger. Once the audience sees behavior repeated over time, explanations get harder. Silence gets louder, and reputations stop being shields and start becoming questions. This is where the discomfort actually lives. Not in what's unseen, but in the realization that what you did see may have been carefully incomplete. Because when a story feels finished without ever feeling fully explained, that's not resolution. That's containment. And containment only works as long as people don't notice it. But they're noticing now. Not emotionally, not angrily, methodically. They're rewatching interviews, revisiting old clips, noticing how often clarity was promised later, and how rarely later ever arrived. They're seeing how quickly attention was redirected every time things got close to coherence. That redirection wasn't dramatic, it was smooth. And smooth control is the hardest kind to detect. This is why independent narratives are dangerous. They don't rush. They don't resolve things neatly. They let questions breathe. And once questions are allowed to breathe, silence loses its authority. Because silence only works when it feels final. When it starts feeling strategic, it becomes unstable. That's the shift happening here. Not exposure, recognition. And recognition doesn't fade when the video ends. By now, the story isn't pulling you forward with shock. It's pulling you inward with awareness. Because once you recognize how control works, you start noticing it everywhere. The pauses that last just a little too long. The answers that sound complete, but never actually answer anything. The way conversations drift away the moment they get close to something that would require clarity. This isn't chaos, it's choreography. Power doesn't need to erase stories anymore. It just needs to manage their shape. Decide how much space they take. Decide when they appear. Decide how quickly the audience is encouraged to move on. And the most effective tool in that process isn't censorship. It's patience. Patience assumes people will get tired. That attention will shift. that tomorrow's headline will replace today's questions. For a long time, that assumption worked perfectly. But something changed. The audience stopped chasing moments and started tracking behavior. They stopped reacting and started remembering. They noticed how often things were left unfinished, how often context was postponed, how often silence showed up exactly when explanation would have mattered most. That's not coincidence, that's design. And design only stays invisible as long as no one points at it. What makes this phase uncomfortable isn't that anyone has been accused. It's that the system itself has been noticed. Once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. Every future decision gets measured against it. Every pause feels intentional. Every omission feels weighted. This is where silence begins to fail. Not because it proves anything, but because it stops feeling neutral. It stops feeling earned. It starts feeling like a choice made repeatedly, consistently, under the same conditions. And choices tell stories. Stories about what matters. Stories about what doesn't. Stories about who gets protected by time and who doesn't. This is why the conversation doesn't need escalation anymore. It doesn't need louder claims or stronger language. It just needs continuity. Because continuity exposes systems better than confrontation ever could. And once continuity is established, the pressure doesn't come from outrage. It comes from expectation. Expectation that if nothing was wrong, explanation wouldn't have been avoided. That if clarity was available, it wouldn't have been postponed indefinitely. That's the tension sitting here now. Quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. And it only grows the longer nothing is said. At this point, the silence starts to feel heavier than any allegation ever could. Because silence isn't empty. It's active. It fills space. It redirects attention. It signals confidence. Not that nothing happened, but that nothing needs to be said. That's the part most people miss. Silence isn't used when there's nothing to answer. Silence is used when answers would create more questions. And that's where this story quietly tightens. Every time something was left out, the explanation sounded reasonable on the surface. Time limits, legal boundaries, editorial focus, all acceptable, all defensible. But when the same reasoning appears again and again, across different moments, different platforms, different years, it stops sounding practical. It starts sounding patterned. Patterns don't accuse. Patterns reveal priorities. They show you what gets protected by distance. They show you what gets diluted by time. They show you how often later is promised and how rarely it arrives. This is why the audience's role matters more now than ever. Because nothing dramatic has to happen next. No new footage, no explosive statement. The pressure already exists. It exists every time an old clip is rewatched with fresh eyes. Every time a familiar answer feels incomplete. Every time silence appears where clarity would have closed the loop. That's when people stop asking what's hidden and start asking why avoidance was always enough. Avoidance only works when no one tracks it. But people are tracking now, quietly, patiently, without rushing to conclusions. And patience is dangerous to systems built on delay. Because delay assumes forgetting, patience assumes memory. This is where the balance shifts. Not because anyone is exposed, but because the strategy has been recognized. Once recognition sets in, silence no longer buys safety. It buys attention. And attention, when it doesn't move on, becomes the one thing silence was never designed to survive. By this stage, the story stops feeling unfinished. It starts feeling managed. Because when you look back, you realize how often control showed up disguised as calm. How many times nothing was said because saying nothing worked. How often restraint was praised as maturity, even when it left entire questions untouched. That's the uncomfortable realization. Silence wasn't the absence of response, it was the response. And it worked because it trained everyone to expect less. Less detail, less context, less follow-through. Over time, people learned not to push, not because they were convinced, but because nothing ever came from pushing. That's how systems stabilize. They don't argue with questions, they outweight them. But waiting only works when people are impatient. Now the audience is doing the opposite. They're slowing down. They're replaying moments. They're lining things up side by side. And when you do that, What once felt isolated begins to feel intentional. Not malicious, not explosive, intentional. This is where pressure changes shape. It's no longer about demanding answers. It's about noticing patterns of avoidance. Who speaks when it's easy? Who goes quiet when coherence is required? Who benefits when stories remain incomplete? Those observations don't fade. They accumulate. And accumulation is what silence was never built to handle. Because silence depends on distance, on the idea that the past will feel too far away to revisit. But distance collapses when everything is searchable, replayable, and remembered together. The past doesn't stay past anymore. It sits in the present, asking the same unanswered questions. This is why the story doesn't need escalation. It doesn't need new claims or louder voices. The framework is already visible. The structure has already been noticed. From here on, every pause adds weight, not because it proves anything, but because it confirms something. That silence was never neutral. It was the strategy. And once a strategy is seen, it loses its power to hide in plain sight. At this point, the audience isn't leaning forward for revelation. They're leaning back to observe. Because once you understand the pattern, you don't need new information to feel tension. You start watching behavior, timing, choices. You notice how often opportunities to clarify appear and how consistently they pass without being used. That consistency is what changes everything. Not because it proves intent, but because it removes coincidence. When the same response shows up under the same pressure, again and again, it stops being accidental. It becomes habit, and habit tells you more about power than any single statement ever could. This is where silence transforms. It no longer feels like restraint. It feels like insulation. Insulation from follow-up, from accountability, from having to connect moments that were always kept separate. Because connection is dangerous. Connection turns fragments into narratives, and narratives demand coherence. What's unsettling is how effective this has been for so long. Not because people were fooled, but because they were trained. Trained to accept distance as closure. Trained to treat time as resolution. Trained to assume that if something mattered, someone else must have handled it. That assumption did most of the work. But assumptions break when people stop outsourcing curiosity. Now, viewers aren't waiting for authority to tell them what matters. They're deciding for themselves. They're asking quieter questions, but more persistent ones. Why did this never get revisited? Why did that explanation stop short? Why does silence show up at the same points every time? Those questions don't accuse. They accumulate, and accumulation creates gravity. This is where the story gains weight without gaining volume, where nothing dramatic happens, and yet everything feels different. Because now, even doing nothing communicates something. Silence doesn't pause the conversation anymore. It feeds it. And the longer it continues, the clearer it becomes that the quiet wasn't absence. It was architecture. By now, the story doesn't feel like it's moving forward. It feels like it's closing in. Because once architecture is visible, every decision becomes readable. Not as proof, as posture, who engages, who retreats, who answers directly, who lets time answer for them. This is where the tension sharpens. Not because something new appears, but because nothing does. Silence keeps choosing itself. And when the same choice repeats under different spotlights, it stops feeling like coincidence. It feels like confidence. Confidence that explanation isn't required. Confidence that distance will still do the work it's always done. But distance doesn't behave the same anymore. The audience isn't rushing past unanswered questions. They're sitting with them, letting them echo, comparing them across years, across platforms, across moments that once felt unrelated. That comparison changes perception. Old footage doesn't age out, it aligns. Old answers don't soften, they reveal limits. Old silences don't fade, they stack. This is the moment where pressure becomes quiet and constant. Not loud enough to provoke reaction, not dramatic enough to dismiss, just present, persistent, watching. And that's what makes it uncomfortable. Because silence can deflect outrage. It cannot deflect scrutiny. Scrutiny doesn't need confrontation. It needs consistency. And once consistency is observed, the story stops needing momentum. It sustains itself. Every new pause adds context. Every non-answer adds shape. Every delay confirms the pattern. This is why the question has shifted. Not what's hidden, but why is nothing ever completed? Completion would require context. Context would require connection, and connection would turn fragments into a whole. That's the line silence has been guarding. And once people see that line, they stop crossing it emotionally. They stand on it, waiting, because waiting now is no longer passive. It's the loudest response in the room. At this stage, something irreversible has happened. The story no longer needs permission to exist. It's not being driven by claims, leaks, or reveals. It's being driven by memory, by people noticing how often the same doors close at the same moments, how explanations almost arrive, then don't, how clarity is always one step away, but never crossed. That almost is the tell, almost explained, almost addressed, almost resolved. Almost is not an accident. It's a technique, because almost keeps things from collapsing while never letting them settle. It creates just enough movement to avoid confrontation, while never offering enough substance to end the conversation. For years, that balance worked. But balance depends on momentum, and momentum has slowed. Now, every time silence appears, it's logged. Not emotionally, cognitively. Viewers aren't reacting. They're cataloging. They're comparing past responses to present ones, measuring tone against timing, measuring confidence against avoidance. This is where silence becomes data. Data doesn't shout. Data doesn't argue. Data just sits there, accumulating. And accumulation changes the relationship between power and audience. Because once people start tracking behavior instead of statements, reputation stops being a shield. It becomes a variable. That's why this moment feels different without being dramatic. Nothing exploded. No line was crossed. No final statement was made. Yet the pressure is heavier than ever. Because the audience is no longer waiting to be told what matters. They're watching to see if coherence ever arrives, if timelines will ever be walked through, if explanations will ever meet the weight of the questions. And until that happens, silence can't reset the story. It can only deepen it. This is the point where the quiet stops protecting anyone. It starts defining the narrative itself, not as guilt, not as innocence, as choice. And choices once recognized never stop being recognized. This is where the story finally settles. Not into answers, but into awareness. Because once people see how silence has been used, they stop expecting it to mean nothing. They stop reading it as patience or dignity or restraint. They understand it as a decision, repeated carefully, consistently, and confidently over time. That understanding doesn't demand resolution, it changes interpretation. From this point forward, nothing lands the same way. Every future statement is weighed against what was never said before. Every pause is measured against past pauses. Every attempt to move on quietly is met with memory instead of distraction. And memory is the one thing silence can't erase. This isn't about proving anything. It's about recognizing how power operates when it doesn't need to explain itself. How it trusts time to do the work. How it relies on distance, fragmentation, and patience to keep stories from ever fully forming. That strategy worked until people stopped forgetting. Now the audience isn't chasing revelations. They're watching patterns. They're not demanding conclusions. They're noticing absences, and those absences have become impossible to ignore. So the story doesn't end with a reveal. It ends with a shift where silence no longer feels neutral, where restraint no longer feels sufficient, where unfinished stories no longer fade, they linger. And once that shift happens, the narrative can't be reset. Because silence only protects something when people believe it's empty. Now everyone can see it never was.